Now that our block plane has passed inspection, we need to get it set up for everyday use. So that's what we're going to talk about now. The first step most people do when they're setting up a new hand plane is polish the back of the iron. Well, I am a huge fan of the ruler trick, and that means we don't have to bother with polishing the back of the iron. Now, we still do a quick polish each time we sharpen, but we'll cover that in a sharpening video. This is about setup. So when it comes to hand planes, don't worry about polishing the back of the iron. We can do away with that with the ruler trick. Now that we've got that out of the way, we need to decide on an angle. The great feature about bevel up block, well, any bevel up plane or a low angle plane, is the fact that the bevel of the blade is pointing up, which means we can change the angle that the blade meets the wood by changing the angle we hone the blade to. This plane, most bevel up planes, are bedded at 12 degrees, and this is what that would look like in a blown up cross section. A traditional bevel down plane that has a frog and a cap iron and a lever cap is typically bedded at 45 degrees, so you can tell it's a pretty big difference. So if we wanted to be closer to a traditional angle, we would want to hone this iron at about 30 or 35 degrees. We're going to end up with a 47 degree pitch where the bevel of the blade meets the wood. Or you could step it down to 30 degrees and you would have something that's slightly lower than the standard 45 degrees. I take a little bit of a different approach. I hone nearly all of my irons at 40 degrees. And you can see just how much steeper that is than a standard 45 degree. This is more like a high angle frog that you would buy to put into a hand plane so that you could plane at steeper angles. So why would we choose a steeper angle or a shallower angle? Well, a shallower angle is going to cut more easily with less effort through just about anything you cut. So end grain, long grain. The drawback to that is that the shallower angle edge is more delicate. So it's going to dull faster, it's going to require more sharpening. So you're trading ease of use for more frequent sharpening. The other thing that a shallow angle blade struggles with sometimes is when you have curly grain or very high character grain. And I run into that a lot when I'm using the silver maple for the workbenches. So the solution to that is to hone your blade at a steeper angle. 40 degrees is the angle that I prefer, and when you add that to the 12 degree bed, you're looking at a 52 degree angle where the blade meets the wood. And that's closer to the 55 degree angle that you would get on a high angle frog that you could put in a standard, number 4 smoother or a joiner or jack plane. The big advantage here, in addition to being able to handle tougher grain, is the fact that a steeper angle is going to last longer, so you do a little bit less sharpening. The one drawback is that it's a little bit harder to push that plane through the material, but I find that I haven't noticed that to be a big issue, especially since I've been planing at 40 degrees with a bevel up plane longer than I have any other angle. So I'm just used to it being as difficult as it is, and I have, on the occasions that I have switched to a shallower angle, I find that it's not that much easier and it's quite a bit more frustrating to have to stop and sharpen because the blade keeps getting dull. So I'm going to assume that you agree with me and you would like a 40 degree angle honed on your blade. So when we pull the blade out of this body and set it up in the honing guide, we're going to set it for a 40 degree angle. So the first thing we do whenever we pull a blade out of the body of a plane is get your dry rag or your dirt rag or your wipe off rag and clean all the mating surfaces off. And I'm going to take these parts and set them off on a different bench so they don't get sprayed. Next thing I want to do is check the blade to see if it's pretty close to square. And it is. If I had been using this blade, the very first thing I would do when I come up to these stones, I'm going to go ahead and spin these around, is drop this blade flat on the finest grit stone, maybe about a ½ inch of the blade on the stone, and just give it a few swipes. And what this is going to do is slowly over time, it's going to put a little bit of polish right there at the end of the blade. And more importantly, if there's any burr, anything that might be hanging over this flat edge, it's going to take it off so that when you move to your coarse stone, you don't feel a burr that actually is from use and not from sharpening. You want the burr on the back of the blade to be from sharpening. So we're going to drop this into the honing guide. Set it up for 40 degrees. So the reference surface for the honing guide is this flat right here. So I'm putting the tip of this gauge up against the flat. We will do a project on how to make this setup jig. It's a lot more compact than having a board with a bunch of stops or lines on it. So I prefer to use this one here. All right, we're set up for 40 degrees. All right, we're going to put some camber on this iron, so let's talk camber for a minute. The main reason I put camber on my blades, and let me back up again. Camber is a slight curvature that you put at the end of the blade. So it would be like putting a radius at the end of the blade in the shape that the blade cuts. For a jack plane that's set up like a true jack plane, you have a lot of camber, an 8-inch radius over a 2-inch or 2 1/4 inch wide blade. For something like a smoother or a block plane, you don't need a whole lot, because really what you're trying to do is keep the corners up away from the work so that all the cutting happens near the center 2/3 of the blade, so that you don't have gutter marks from the corners of the blade while you're planing. So how much camber do we need? Well, with a standard bedded iron, you don't need very much, because the radius is standing halfway between vertical and flat. So you have quite a bit of curvature for just a little bit of camber. But as you move to a blade that's bedded at 12 degrees, the blade lays back, and that same curvature at the end of your blade doesn't get you as far. So you need to add a little more curvature to get the same result that you would with a blade that's bedded at 45 degrees as opposed to 12. I'm not going to flatten these stones because I'm going to be working them pretty hard, at least this first one, to get this blade shaped. So I'm just going to go to work. I'm going to set the blade here. I'm going to reach across with a finger from my right hand onto the left corner of the blade. It'll be the opposite in the camera here. And then I'm going to put the other finger on top, and I'm putting all my pressure on this corner. Okay, so that was 20 strokes. I'm going to reach across and do the same thing on this corner. Okay, so you can see that the honing is wider on this side. It's a little wider on that side than it is in the middle. But I guess I was putting more pressure on this corner than I was on that corner. So I'm going to need to take a few extra strokes on this side as I continue to shape the end of this blade. Okay, I just took 20 passes on that side that was a little flat. And I normally would never recommend pulling a blade out of a honing guide after you set it up until it was totally sharpened. I wanted you to see, hopefully, just how much we've changed the shape of that blade. It was square when I started, and now you can see light coming through on the corners on either side. That's almost there. It doesn't take much more than that for a block plane or a smoother. One of the things I noticed while I was looking is that the center point has sort of migrated over to towards this side. It's right about here where my pinky is. So I'm going to do about 15 strokes. Let's turn it over. I'm going to do about 15 strokes on this side and 10 more strokes on that side. And that should be enough to shape this blade the way I want it. As I was sharpening there, I was thinking about the fact that the sides of this honing guide are so well machined. I can actually use my square on those to reference the edge. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Let me give you a view here. Okay, so you can see that high spot right in the middle there. So that's a pretty good shape. Now, since I was touching my square to the tip of this blade, I'm just going to make a quick 3-step pass across the 3 facets that I've made in this blade. There's the one on the corner here, there's a facet here, and then there's the center. And I want to make sure that I didn't, ding up that edge with that square. So I'm going to Flip the stone around to get some fresh material. So I'll do 5 strokes on each one. So I'm going to reach across, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Reach across, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then even pressure. And you can see that stripe down the middle where I hadn't cut anything yet. All right, we've got this blade shaped the way we want it. So all we have to do now is sharpen it and put it in the body. And that sharpening process looks exactly like the same process you would use if you had been using it for a year. So we'll cover that as a separate video next. One last thing, when you get a brand new iron, be prepared to sharpen it a little more often at first. Sometimes in the heat treating process, that thin edge can get a little bit brittle, and you need to sharpen your way through it before you get to the good, even tempered steel. That's another reason why I tend to lean towards a 40-degree angle, a steeper angle, is because even though the steel is a little more brittle, the edge is a little bit tougher. It's a little more reinforced by that steeper angle. So keep that in mind as you start out with a new plane iron.